and the degree to which they are or are not interlinked. If I was writing a headline for this debate, I'd say, "Are the robots eating our jobs?" Or rather, are the international robots eating our jobs? And if so, what can we do about it? I was chairing a similar panel in Davos at the start of this year, and I was very struck because the World Economic Forum gave me some briefing notes which suggested that studies by McKinsey's and others thought that over the next couple of decades, up to 60% of American jobs could be replaced by robots, or rather more accurately, by digital networks. And there's another study which recently struck me, which is that Brian Arthur, a West Coast economist, recently estimated that over the next decade, the total output of all the economic functions performed by interlinked networks around the world will be equivalent to the entire US economy. He says it's a bit like having an aircraft carrier stationed off the shores of the US economy, which is the second shadow US economy, but of course only employs robots, computers, not humans at the moment. Although again, we can argue about whether this will create more jobs or not. So these are huge issues of the age. But before I turn to the two esteemed professors to ask them what they think, I want to do something very quickly with the audience. Not to put the professors in their place, but to have a bit of sort of crowd voting here. I'm going to ask you two questions. First question, do you think that technology and globalization is partly to blame for income inequality today? Hands up who thinks yes. Hands up who thinks no. Interesting, we could actually have a great debate. For those of you who think that technology and globalization is partly to blame, do you think that's inevitable, or do you think there's any way to stop the negative consequences? Those of you who think it's just inevitable that the robots eat our jobs, or something like that, phrased in smart economics terms, hands up now. Those of you who think there are things that policymakers can do, hands up. Hey, well, you guys believe in government. That's great.
We're in New York.
Exactly. Well, I think, Professor Sachs, with that word, over to you.
Good. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with all of you this evening and with Paul and you, Jillian. There's a lot going on, so don't expect in a conversation a single explanation for a single phenomenon, because if we define any of those terms, there's a lot in each of them. Even as we think about inequality, we could talk about the super rich, we could talk about the dispersion of wages in the labor market, we could talk about the gaps of earnings between college and high school, educated workers in the population. We could talk about the changing functional income distribution between capital and labor, with a rising measured share of capital and a declining measured share of labor. And then for all of those, we could have a long, long discussion about the measurement problems. And what are we really measuring, and are we measuring these things correctly, and so forth. So just to define the terms quickly as I see them, we do have rising inequality in many senses, and I've mentioned the ones that I think are most important. We have a super rich class, which is a particular phenomenon that has been growing in size. We have a changing income distribution by educational attainment or other indicators. We have even properly measured a changing distribution of income between capital and labor that matters. Now, it's also true that if these were primordial, fundamental factors of shared globalization and technology, we would see essentially the same trends everywhere, which we don't see. We see different levels and even different directions of change of inequality, though there is some overall tendency within economies for widening inequality, there are big differences. And the US is at the upper end of both the rise and the level of inequality by almost any of the measures that I've just defined. So something special is going on here. It's also important to say that another fundamental distinction is income inequality or wealth inequality before taxes or after taxes and transfers, because governments change the prospects by helping the poor if they do, or taxing the rich if they do, or the reverse sometimes. And we have in the United States a relatively small fiscal correction, whereas Scandinavia has a large fiscal correction. So the Scandinavian countries famed for smaller income inequality and much less rise, though some, also correct the income inequality. So the answer that I'm going to try to suggest this evening is that robots have mattered, if you use that as the shorthand for technological change. Globalization has mattered in a distinct way through trade and investment flows. Globalization's also mattered in weakening unions and strengthening capital through a number of channels. And our domestic politics in this country have been rotten for about 35 years, because instead of weighing against these changes, we put the thumb on them, because as we increasingly understand, the country is run by and for billionaires, and it's not run for the average benefit of the population. And that means that every chance, with all of you who raised your hands and said we could do something about it, true. Are we doing something about it? No. And that's one of the distinctive features of America in recent years.
Right. Well, can I just ask, before I turn to Professor Krugman, Professor Sachs, do you think that it is inevitable that technology, I mean, I use the word robots because it's easier to pronounce than digital networks. Do you think that it's inevitable that technology is going to destroy jobs? Because I've just come back from Silicon Valley, and there the argument is, but all these wonderful new devices are going to create a whole new economy with a whole new collection of jobs, and so stop worrying.
Generally, machines, whether they're artificial intelligence or robotics or the kinds of machines that we have seen developed over the last couple of centuries, are good. What they have tended to do over time is truly destroy the burdens of physical labor. And we, as human beings, don't like physical labor too much. And so the deepest trend of the last 200 years is that the amount of time that we need to spend in backbreaking labor has gone down extraordinarily, except in the poorest places in the world where people are bent over doing excruciating, painful, difficult farm work hours every day, virtually every day of the year. Machines are good, and the new vintage of machines can also be very good. So in this sense, will they take our jobs? Yes, in the sense of giving potentially more leisure, more benefit, better health. I'm a technophile. I think that this is possible. But what's also true is that major technological changes cause social disruptions and labor market disruptions, and have since the beginning of the industrial era. Workers probably experienced a decline of living standards by the millions, and that's what Engels wrote about in the early 19th century. And we know that when the cotton gin came in, African Americans were desperately impoverished by this, and with very serious social consequences. The experience that we have now, I think, is disrupting many pathways of traditional employment. But there is a basic proposition of economics that I would assert, and that is a pure gain of efficiency or pure technological advance that allows you to do more with less is potentially beneficial for everybody, but market forces may not act that way. You need government alongside the technology to ensure that the benefits are widely spread.
Right, so call for government action.
Yes,
Well,
yes.
we don't yet appear to have had any robots that can replace economics professors.
Oh, that's going to be easy, by the way.
Many of them are, many of us are indistinguishable from robots even now.
Okay, well, on that point, I'd like to press button A and get your speech about technology. To what degree do you think we can blame income inequality today on technology and globalization, or is there something else?
So let me first just take a moment to talk about the deep history. And one thing I've learned from my European colleagues, actually, especially from Branko Milanovic here, but also from Thomas Piketty, is the uses of literature as a window into the past, how it was, but also how people thought. And I don't know how many people remember or have ever read I believe it's an early 50s novel by Kurt Vonnegut, Player Piano, which was a novel which was about a society where work has been destroyed by automation, where things, and it of course wasn't robots, was a much less sophisticated form of technological progress than we're now talking about. But he imagined this would destroy lots of jobs, would destroy meaningful work. And he was not wrong about the progress of automation. The generation that followed World War II was in fact an era of the fastest productivity growth that we've ever had, before or since. But it was also an era of great progress for across the board, a strong middle class, because not so much because new jobs were created to replace the kinds of things as because we consumed more stuff. So manufacturing workers were much more productive, and we consumed lots more consumer goods. And so the technology does not have to, even if it's rapid change, does not have to hurt. In fact, over the long sweep, it, at least historically, has tended to help. Even when it does destroy whole kinds of work, that needn't be a bad thing. So when you say, well, 60% of jobs could be replaced, there was a time when more than 60% of the workforce was in agriculture. And at this point, we have essentially no farmers. We have more. The number I like is there are more Americans who play World of Warcraft than there are farmers, right? So it's just not a thing that happens, and that's okay too. So that's the optimistic view. On the other hand, we know both in principle and to some extent in practice that it doesn't have to work out that well. That in fact, if you go way back to David Ricardo, the father of comparative advantage, the case for free trade and all of that, he had a chapter in his classic book on machinery, arguing that in fact new technology of the kind that was coming along with the Industrial Revolution, capital-intensive techniques, could very well destroy jobs, could reduce the demand for labor. And so right back there in 1819, you have him saying that technology can actually hurt ordinary people. So that's, and the best we can tell, the data aren't great, but the best we can tell is that the British Industrial Revolution produced stagnation or possibly declining wages for around 40 years. So if you say in the long run it's okay, 40 years is kind of a long time. The US Industrial Revolution came later, doesn't quite look the same way on the wage data, but in many respects, workers did actually they moved into dirty, unhealthy urban centers. Life expectancy appears to have gone down. So technological change can very easily have negative effects for a very long time. And there's no guarantee that even that it ever is positive. Question is this what's going on right now? And first of all, on inequality, we have had, at least if we're talking about the United States, we're talking about advanced countries, we've actually had two eras. Up until around 2000, it seemed like inequality was very much a labor versus labor issue. We did not seem to be seeing a shift from workers to capitalists. We seem to be seeing a shift from less educated to more educated workers, and then within the more educated workers, this 1%, this tail streaking off into the stratosphere. But one thing that seemed really clear, it was not about capital versus labor. But that stopped being true around 2000. Since then, it really has seemed to be capital versus labor. And that could be consistent with capital using technological change. It could be basically the David Ricardo's chapter on machinery come to life in the 21st century. But that is by no means certain, and there are some problems with that. The main problem you'd want to say is if that were the case, if what we were having was technology that made it possible to dispense with workers or do very little and instead do very capital-intensive stuff, reduce demand for labor, increase demand for capital, then the rate of return on investment ought to be really high. And yet here we are in a world with zero or actually in some cases negative interest rates that seems to be awash in savings with no place to go, which doesn't seem consistent with that story. Now that might be its all business cycle, but I suspect that it's not. That looks like it's been a gradually building trend, which leads you to possible other stories. And the story that is consistent with it, but we have not a whole lot of evidence, is that we're actually talking about, as I've said, it could be robots or it could be robber barons. Increased monopoly power could be driving a wedge between what workers earn, what they produce, and what gets charged for the products they produce. And that could be consistent with, a monopolist doesn't need to expand his capacity. That could be consistent with what we're seeing. I think that what we have to say is that a simple technologically deterministic story does not seem to fit what we're seeing. And just, I will say a lot more about this, I'm sure, but there's a lot of reason to believe not just that governments can tax and spend and redress the effects of technological inequality, but that in fact a lot of what's happening is not just the gods of technology telling us what must happen, but in fact social constructs that could be different in a different political environment.
Well, the concept of robots meet robber barons sounds like a fabulous book title.
The alliteration is something that, there's one thing I've learned in 15 years at the Times, it's how to do alliterative things.
I'm curious though, I mean, if it is robots meets robber barons and the combination of concentrations of wealth and power managing to essentially capture technology or use technology to entrench their position perhaps, I don't know if I'm capturing what you think accurately.
Not exactly, but parts of it.
Okay. I get a B plus grade?
So actually, well, since we're on this, two things. One is that we could simply be talking about an increase in monopoly power that is for entirely different reasons than the changes in technology. That simply you have a lax regulation, antitrust sort of disappeared from the scene. The political environment has turned very, very pro-corporate, pro-business. You could also be talking about actually as technology changes the mix of the economy and as constraints on the power of organized business, of organized capital, fail to keep up with those changes. That could be part of it. If you ask, when we talk about, Jeff mentioned unionization. The decline in unionization of manufacturing has fallen in part thanks to globalization, though it's not clear that it had to do as much as it did. But the failure of unionization to spread into the service sector has nothing to do with that. I mean, the largest, back when General Motors was the largest employer, it had a powerful union. Okay. Globalization makes it hard to do that in auto manufacturing these days. Today, the largest employer in America is Walmart, which isn't exposed to global competition at all. It's in retail trade. And the fact that Walmart is not unionized is not because of global forces. It's not really because of technology. It's because during the period when it was getting big, the Reagan administration was extremely anti-labor and in fact turned a blind eye to outright violations of labor law. So that's a political decision.
And yet, just to push back on that, I mean, one of the things that enables Walmart today to be Walmart is that not only is it reaping the benefits of the barcode, i.e. digital networks inside America, its entire supply chain is reliant on the barcode, on technological links. I mean, technology has basically linked the globe in a way that means that companies can straddle the world in a way they never could 100 years ago.
It's still true, though, that it's a domestic retailer that is not in direct competition with retailers abroad. Its supply chain is global. So I think that all of these explanations suggest that you have to have a political category. You have to have a globalization category because there really is a phenomenon and it's more and more clear. A lot of jobs were lost to offshoring. There's no question. A lot of jobs have been lost to imports coming from China and elsewhere. And while for a long time, even though it's pretty standard trade and foreign investment theory that says that this would keep wages low, there was resistance among a lot of economists, but now there's less resistance because it's really there that this has made a difference. And I would say I'm a bit more disposed to the technology changing the mix of the workflow, especially in manufacturing, but I think it's going to sweep a lot of services and business processing as well. That's artificial intelligence and robotics, literally, that is making a difference. It's very hard to have any one of those as a decisive, all-encompassing explanation because, as Paul has said, I'm trying to point to the same phenomena. There's always something missing by a single factor. And more than that, if it were really just one of those, we would probably expect to see much more consistent experience in other countries as well. And we really do see a lot of divergences. America's really distinctive on the political, social side.
Right.
We've had a long stretch of center-right governance in this country now for stretching back to at least January 20th, 1981, that essentially has continued until now, I would argue. And that this means that our dynamics are really quite different from a lot of other advanced industrial and post-industrial economies.
Right. Well, I'd like to ask you something, though, about the implications of all this for global workforce patterns, because I was very struck recently chatting to a CEO of one of the biggest industrial companies in America, who told me, great news, we're bringing jobs back to America, because they have now essentially digitized their processes to such a point where, although a Chinese worker or an Indian worker is cheaper than an American industrial worker, a computer is cheaper than a Chinese worker. And because of that difference, it's actually now cost effective, plus energy costs falling in America, but it's cost effective to bring factories back to America. And they were very proud of themselves because they had just built this huge, great plant down in the South. So I said to them, well, that's very impressive. And they gave me the amazing numbers for how much they were producing out of this plant.
And no jobs.
200 jobs.
Exactly.
Right.
In the entire
You're
plant,
not, I mean, that
200
just,
jobs.
Right.
No, so they had brought back 200 jobs back to America, whereas perhaps 50 years ago you might have had 20,000 jobs in America, then you had jobs in China, now you have 200 jobs in Georgia.
Just to say, by the way, that although this is basically true. It is basically true that manufacturing employment it's declining everywhere, and the stuff that you're likely to bring back to the United States is almost by definition going to be the very labor non-intensive stuff.
A robot.
But not entirely. That's actually, it's kind of interesting. A lot of us have been searching for some sign that wages are going up for somebody in America, and it turns out there are certain skill categories that have been getting big increases, and one of them was featured, I think, last year in a story in the Times is sewing machine operators. It turns out that actually the apparel industry, they've discovered they overreached in outsourcing. There is a case to have some of an apparel industry in the United States, and it turns out we don't have anybody in this country who knows how to operate a sewing machine. So there are stories like that. But no, no, it is true and manufacturing employment. The fact of the matter is that the U.S. manufacturing sector has shrunk to a significant degree because of imports. But even if that hadn't happened, we would still have a manufacturing sector that was a shadow of its former self because it's robots.
But a sewing machine is exactly the kind of activity that robotics is becoming a master in. And that's why even when you go to Bangladesh, it's automated. It's crazy. And so that really is a repeated, predictable, servo mechanism, machine-led
Although one of the
type of activity.
One of the things that's interesting about the current direction of technology is a lot of it now seems to be eating into what we think of as high cognitive skills. That's the whole big data and all of that. We're still nowhere close to having machines that are intelligent the way we are, but it turns out there's a lot of other ways to produce the simulation of intelligence it's like speech recognition went from being a joke to being usable. Still kind of funny, but usable. And that means that in many ways the jobs that are safest may often be manual labor that involves common sense, involves interacting with a complicated real world. Economics professors may be relatively easy to replace. Actually, journalists we know are relatively easy to replace with this stuff. So and I'm one of each, so that's...
Well, I was actually over in the West Coast last week talking to a number of artificial intelligence experts, and one of them told me a wonderful story, which he always likes to relate to illustrate the problem with AI, which is that if you had an AI robot which was trained to obey the Asimov's 3 laws, which is basically do no harm to humans, do no harm to yourself, the robot, and obey human laws. If you put that robot in charge of feeding some children in a domestic house and said, feed the kids, you could come back and discover that the robot had obeyed all 3 of Asimov's laws, but had basically cooked the cat to feed the kids. So the issue of judgment is what... issue of judgment is what, unfortunately...
Actually, Hal Varian, chief economist at Google, told me that the big problem with the self-driving cars is that they will have to be programmed legally to obey traffic laws, which means that in any major city they will not get anywhere.
So there'll still be jobs for taxi drivers. But I guess the key question is, if you had a magic wand or $4 billion to run for president, if that's enough these days, what are the top 3 policy initiatives that you would unveil to try and deal with this? Because we have an audience which believes there is something that government can do. This is not inevitable. We do have the choice in our hands to find a way to deal with these forces of globalization and technology and inequality. So if you had 3 things on a postcard, what would you do? Professor Sachs.
Let's start again with helping people who are struggling at the bottom. That's not the whole story here, but that's a big part of our city. It's a big part of our country, and that's easy to do. And again, that's a case where the U.S. just does very badly on what has been completely solved in the countries of Northern Europe. So the problem, though, is that to do that, we require some tax revenues. And we require also going after some big privileged of our lobbies, probably most importantly, the unbelievably costly healthcare system, which is a system of privilege and prerogative and a state-created monopoly. So there are things to do to help people at the bottom. Parental leave, sick leave guaranteed, guaranteed child care, universal pre-K, as Mayor de Blasio has famously put in our city in a wonderful initiative. But look how hard he had to fight with Albany to get it, including with our Democratic Party governor, Governor Cuomo, who just shuddered at the idea that very rich people might have to pay a little bit to do that. Second thing I would do is eliminate the incredible privilege at the top, which is absurd. And again, without having to rehearse what everybody knows, we have a tax system that is geared towards the largest hedge fund owners that makes absolutely no sense except political sense, which is it is defended by our Congress, which happens to get its money from those very hedge fund owners for that $4 billion election you just mentioned. And so this is part of the rot of our system, which is that we not only have the super rich, but we have opened the door for them to own the congressional and legislative process. So that's the second area. And then the third, I think, is to make sure that in that broad middle and across generations that we have some fairness and some redistribution. Capital as a whole has really reaped huge benefits, and profits have been very, very high, and the earnings at the top have been extraordinary, and workers have had stagnant wages, even if they're not at the very bottom. We could do better than that with some redistribution. And the basic lesson of the core theory of how robotics would work is that it would, if it does have these effects, which I believe it to have, of lowering wages, lowering labor demand, and raising the returns to capital, the gains to capital are larger than the losses to the workers, so that net transfers can essentially make all groups and all generations better off. That's the good news of technological advance. We can live better. But there are the distributional effects that need to be compensated. And that would be my third plank.
Right, okay. So three-part manifesto.
The bottom, the top, and the middle.
Okay, well, that's pretty comprehensive.
To put it simply.
Okay, Professor Krugman, would you vote for that manifesto, or have you got a better one?
Yeah, but since I have to pick three, I'm going to swap out two of them, even though I'm for everything that Jeff's for. But
so you're getting five by default.
So large expansion of aid to disadvantaged children, and that would come on multiple fronts. That would include things like school lunches, but we need to spend more on school lunches. It's basically, essentially, because of the very little amount that we spend, we have to, one way or another, feed kids corn. It's either corn directly or corn that's gone through pigs. So it's very unhealthy, and you can actually look at that and all these things. I mean, think about the fact that we're realizing, with all the stuff that's going on in Baltimore, how many children are still being exposed to lead poisoning. That's insane in a wealthy country, right? And that's insane even on a fiscal basis, because that's going to cost taxpayers money in the long run. So a lot more spending on children. Clearly, that's sort of it should be a no-brainer, except nothing ever seems to be. I would push for, as a second thing, much stiffer financial regulation. Dodd-Frank is a whole lot better than nothing, but it's a long way from where we should be. And if you sit down and just look at first principles of what we should be doing, if you do, Anand Madi's done this sort of thing, it really says we should have vastly higher capital requirements, that we should have much more intense regulation of financial institutions, which would, among other things, a lot of those super high incomes are coming through the financial system, and there is not a shred of evidence that all of that wheeling and dealing is a positive for the economy. So we could do quite a lot right there. Third, if I had to make it one specific proposal, I'd say card check. If I had to make it a broader, enhance the ability of the bargaining power of workers. Card check would make it vastly easier for workers to organize, higher minimum wages, generally make strengthen the labor laws, but in particular enforce the ones that are on the books to prevent employers from intimidating workers as they try to organize. Because there's a lot of evidence. I mean, it's one of those funny things that these days, if you look for places where you can read like liberal activist screeds, you go to the IMF blog, right? And the IMF has been saying that unionization seems to make a big difference to inequality, not just in the middle, not just at the bottom, but even at the top, because it's a countervailing force. So enhance the power of labor. Those would be the things. I think it is important to say that Jeff and I are both card-carrying economists, and our instinct is always to say, well, you let the market do its thing, and then you tax, and then you transfer. But in fact, there's lots of reason to believe that policy can make a large difference pre-tax and transfer, that the market distribution of income is not dictated by the unchallengeable invisible hand, that there's a lot you can do about it.
But there's one thing I find very interesting listening to both of you, which is, as I said at the beginning of this discussion, back in January, I actually moderated quite a similar event in Davos with a group of CEOs and general luminaries, very much not just the 1%, but probably the 0.1%. And I asked them the same question. And what they came back with was education, and a bit of digital inclusion, i.e., if we could just get the poor, the unemployed, on the internet and get them educated, it would all be fine. Now, as someone who trained as an anthropologist, that strikes me as an awful lot of sort of almost magical thinking. But I mean, what do you think about that? Because neither of you mentioned digital inclusion or the internet or education as a top priority.
There is arguing that education is the thing gosh, that's so 1990s. I mean, there's no even then.
I think it's quite really a 1990s crowd, but yes.
Even then, it wasn't really true. But first of all, just look at who the the winners in this distributional war have been. It's not it's not having a college degree. It's not even having a graduate degree. I mean, the school teachers and hedge fund managers have similar levels of education, right? So it's really not about education, and there's substantial evidence that to the extent that there was an increasing demand for highly educated cognitive labor, that ended early last decade. That in fact, if anything, it looks like the drift has been away from that. That what's happening now is it's still true that having a college education gets you a better job than not, or makes you more likely to have a job. But there's a fairly reasonably good evidence that we're seeing a process actually of crowding down, where the college-educated people are taking jobs that would previously been taken by somebody without that education because they are ahead in the queue, but not really using it. And it's I think this popularity of education as a story comes partly because it's, especially in America, we always believe in education. Partly because it's non-intrusive. It doesn't require that we have higher taxes. It doesn't require that CEOs have to deal with unions again. So they like education.
It's clear why I like education too.
I'm for education. Well, everybody likes education.
Yeah, so
Well, you're paid by education.
right, exactly. We should praise education. It
Right.
actually is still a good return and all of that, but obviously it's the easy answer for that group. That's the top point, probably 0.01 of 1%. So it's important. If you don't have, actually in this country, it is really true. If you don't have a bachelor's degree, or you're a gazillionaire, one of the two, you have a hard time actually finding a decent job. So there really is something to that is right. But it's such a modest part of all the things we're talking about that it's the easy answer, the glib answer, not the serious answer.
Right. Well, I'm going to turn to the audience for questions in just a minute. So while you're thinking of your questions, I'm going to ask you all to vote on one other issue, which I also did in Davos. And I won't tell you the results in Davos yet. But it's quite a good way to just frame the debate. It's also a way to check you're still awake. All of you who think that income inequality, all of you who think that income inequality is going to get worse over the next decade, raise your hands. In the United States? In the United States. Sorry, we're just dealing with the United States, yes. Okay, who thinks it's going to lessen the income inequality? Interesting. So Professor Sachs is on the side of the optimists. Interesting. Quickly, what do you make of that?
Well,
And then we'll have questions.
okay, so there's two possibilities.
Actually, three, Paul.
There's two possibilities about what's driving the audience. One is that that you're just extrapolating, which is not such a bad. That would have worked for you for the last 30 years, extrapolating from the trend. And the other is that you may have a sense that there really is a sort of fundamental dynamic, which I think there is. If nothing else, just plain Piketty logic. The fact of the matter is that we have an enormous amount of wealth that has already been accumulated, and it is wealth breeds wealth, and we're seeing an increased concentration. And it used to be that we said, well, but it's really about labor income, not capital income, but that's not true anymore. So if nothing else, and certainly I'm not sure entirely about income, but wealth, I take a look at it, and particularly the role of inherited wealth, seems to me it would take something dramatic for that not to increase a lot. Right. Just go through the list of wealthiest people in America. Many of them are already heirs, and those who aren't are all 80 years old. So we're about to see the emergence of the patrimonial capitalism. Whether it's actually going to be an increase in the Gini coefficient, I'm not sure, though I would guess it probably is.
Right. Professor Sachs, 95% of the room disagree with you.
No, they may be right. It is a matter of saying that our kind of miserable political processes will continue for another 10 years. I think that's what
that's the point.
That's I think what this is really about. And you could be right. I have waited and waited and waited for Arthur Schlesinger's political cycle to kick in because it's way overdue right now. And it was supposed to kick in 2008. It didn't quite make it. And we do have swings in this country, and we're way overdue for our next progressive era. So that is what I was advocating.
I actually can't, I guess I can't resist the point I was going to make. When Jeff, when you said that we've had 35 years of center-right dominance in America,
yes.
That era is over. We're either going to have progressives or hard-right dominance in America
right.
looking forward.
Which certainly makes the election interesting. But,
Kansasification of America.
exactly. Well, this is where the chance where you get to say, get your own say in the audience. We have 2 microphones. I think, do we have roving microphones as well? I don't think so. So you'll have to queue up in old-fashioned style next to the microphones. It would be courteous but not compulsory to identify yourself. The one thing that is absolutely compulsory is no long speeches. So I'm going to basically impose a 30-second rule. I literally will cut you off after 30 seconds. So the professors are allowed to make speeches, you are not. So we'll start on that side first.
That's inequality.
Before there was a red state, blue state divide, Tip O'Neill said all politics is local. I was taught if you don't pay your debts, you'll lose your house, your car. If you have a job, you lose part of your salary. You'll probably lose your wife. $17 trillion is a big number. My question is, can the government ever pay its debt of $17 trillion? Now, the only Keynes that I know of...
30 seconds.
Good question.
The only Keynes that I know of is the Keynes my grandfather raised to make a point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Paul likes debt more than I do, so I'll let Paul start.
Of all the things to be worrying about right now, really, with interest rates at the lowest levels in history, with U.S., yes, the U.S. has a large debt relative to GDP. You know, $17 trillion, everything about the U.S. economy is a gigantic number. Relative to GDP, it is not the highest it's ever been in this country. It's nothing like the levels that Britain had in the mid-20th century. It's, I mean, we can go on and on, but I think that's really not what we're here to talk about. But just to say, boy, of all the things at this moment, with all of the things going wrong with distribution, with the markets, which are supposed to know what they're talking about, not at all concerned about U.S. debt, why make that your central focus?
Right. Yeah, we have a question over on this side.
Do you think the global trade agreements that the United States has entered into has heightened inequality, and what is your view about the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement? And is that a good idea or a bad idea as far as whether it'll affect inequality?
Jeff?
I think in general, the globalization has had some effect on widening the inequalities and basically on lowering wages, which is broadly what you would expect from both the trade side and the fact of offshoring or investment abroad. So I think that there has been an effect. It's part of what we're talking about, that it's one of the 3 or 4 factors that has fed into what we've seen. The current agreements, I'm not very, or the current TPP and TTIP, so-called, the one is with mostly Asia and the Pacific region, the other with the transatlantic region. I think are far from compelling, and I would not support them or fast track right now on the basis of what we know. These are largely not even trade agreements, by the way. They're mostly agreements about regulation and foreign investment. And they give even more power to multinational companies and threaten the legal systems of all of the contracting parties through some ad hoc and not so savory mechanisms that we're seeing are quite dangerous. So I am against rushing into these agreements the way they are now. First and finally, I would say it is absolutely shocking to my mind that Congress is being asked to vote on them and the American people have not seen any text, whereas hundreds of corporate lobbyists have seen these texts. And so whether congressmen can go into a secret room with special clearance and not take notes and not get a copy of it and look at it and call that enough for us to make a decision that we're going to put a fast track on this is, in my view, out of the question and undemocratic. So at a minimum, to answer your question, we don't even know the text except what we read in WikiLeaks or what we're told by inside informants. And for that alone, I would say no. But from everything that I do know, which actually is a significant amount of discussion with the negotiators, this is not ready for prime time. This is a business deal that we should be very, very wary of.
Yeah, we're in agreement. I'm a non-hysterical opponent of these deals. I'm not part of the group that thinks that it's the death of democracy or the death of the American workers. They're not as important as people imagine. But past trade agreements, which actually liberalized trade, probably did hurt U.S. workers at the bottom, at least after a certain point. You can argue that from a cosmopolitan global point of view, they were good things. That it's really important that a place like Bangladesh be able to have access to world markets. So you can make that argument. But this is not a trade agreement. These are not trade agreements. They are intellectual property agreements. They are dispute settlement procedure agreements that actually end up privatizing a significant part of that process. It's not at all clear why should the American public be expected to support an agreement that is largely about enhancing patent rights for the pharmaceutical industry? This is not what we should be doing.
Well, to be balanced, I'm going to go from right to left, back and forth. So, sir.
Yeah, in simple terms, I'm trying to understand what you guys are talking about. First, you say technology is not a problem. And then I can hear that you saying, well, actually, it's a problem because, the rich on top are getting richer, whatever. And then in terms of solutions, I don't see a paradigm shift. You seem to be proposing that, we have to go on the left. And believe me, I'm center-right, and that scares me. Okay, but at the same time, I want to understand the dynamics of the situation. So I have some questions about
one question.
If technology is progressing so much, I'm daring to ask, what about a planned economy, even though that scares me? And secondly, if we're trying to computerize all kinds of professions, even economics professors, why don't we computerize the business profession also? We need businessmen. I'm daring asking those questions.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not sure I quite got that, but let me just say, let me use this to make a totally unrelated. No, not totally unrelated. One thing that I think we may have allowed to slide through implicitly is the notion that we are in fact seeing revolutionary technological progress. And while, of course, in Silicon Valley they're going to tell you that, you certainly don't see it in the productivity statistics. And there's an argument from, and even some people in Silicon Valley, I'll come back to that in a sec, there's an argument, Robert Gordon has argued, interestingly, I'm not sure, I'm not persuaded, but I'm persuadable that in fact the best days of economic growth may be behind us. And if you look at these technologies, they're all pretty nifty, but remarkably few seem to actually do much in the material physical world. So that's the Peter Thiel, the famous quote that says, we were promised flying cars, and instead we got 140 characters. It is, there is an argument that says that we're just overstating what technology is doing.
Uber.
Yes. Would you agree that technology is overhyped?
No. This is big and significant and deep and transformative. And it's making a very large difference and potentially an enormous difference. We have now 7 billion people with mobile connectivity, and that is transforming the lives of the poor in a very beneficial way, by the way, in a lot of the world. And information technology is transforming every scientific area as well, and so there's a lot more to come. So on this, I don't buy that argument at all. Actually, I think we're in a major technological era, and the information age is extremely deep and transformative. And we would not have genomics, we wouldn't have all of the advances of molecular biology, we wouldn't have advances in renewable energy, which is a very big and very important deal, were it not for this same revolution of information, semiconductors, advanced materials. So it's all part of a major advance, in my view, that it happens to be our turn in these long waves of technology. But I regard it as very deep and deeply transformative.
Right.
And disruptive, and potentially very positive, is the point we're making,
Right.
or that I would suggest.
I actually really feel that I don't know, that it's that I can be persuaded, because it's just, and part of the problem is because not quite yet being robot professors, that this technology affects the kind of thing we do, which means that we may have a distorted perspective. That arguably 20 years from now, looking back, people will say that it was the energy technologies, not all this IT stuff, which are not completely independent of each other, but not exactly the same thing either.
Close.
That mattered.
Yeah.
I guess it raises a question of back during the agricultural revolution or the industrial revolution, would people at that time, the academics, the intellectuals, have had any sense of the scale of change that was upon them? So.
I'm trying to remember.
Well, Adam Smith wrote the same year that James Watt brought out his improved steam engine, and of course Smith had no idea of what was about to happen. So it's interesting that it is hard to know. But I would say Marx got it by 1848, this scale of the transformation, because the whole Communist Manifesto is actually praise over the top for the dynamism of this new bourgeois system. And there it was completely clear that the whole world was remaking itself, and that's what makes that book so astounding, was that it carries all that weight that actually has carried us forward for now 180 years.
But well into the 1830s, you can find Rural Rise, I can't remember the author, but you can find seemingly acute observers of the English scene saying that England is getting poorer, not richer. It took a remarkably long time for people to understand the scale, the extent of the transformation.
Right, which is a very salutary tale for us journalists.
That's a little bit different, though, because Engels said that in 1844, but he was referring to
workers. No, but this
the workers.
That was, it just want to say that it's what seems totally obvious in 2020 hindsight, whatever, obvious things, but it's not. If we think that people were sitting there in 1830 and saying, I'm going through an industrial revolution, many of them were not.
Interesting. Next question.
Professor once told me that D.H. Lawrence got it, but that's enough.
A little bit late in the game.
My question is, what will the effect if we did invest in public works, which not only building a bridge, but building the infrastructure for the information age, which will spread it out. But I'd like to hear your opinion.
Well, I'm for it. We've been incredibly neglecting public investment. in this country and to some extent elsewhere. I mean, it's actually shocking to take a look at German figures, discover how much Germany has been neglecting public investment. Not as much as we have, but there too. And there's no reason that our roads and bridges should be as bad as they are. There's no reason why we shouldn't have, in many cases, municipal Wi-Fi is actually something that, as far as I've been able to find out, makes utter sense given the technology, but we're not doing it. So all of that would be good. Now, I think if you expect it to be transformative, to do more than add a little bit to our, significantly, but not transformatively, to our rate of economic growth, that's probably wrong. It's not, but I would just say you have the lowest, again, very low interest rates, obviously crying need for infrastructure, and article in the Times today just reminding us about what the Port Authority has not done in and around New York in all of these years. So this is, it's certainly doing something, anything to the bus terminal would be a positive thing for the world.
Yeah, I think there's one more thing to add, which is the most important thing we have to do is transform the energy system here and worldwide. And that's not a small matter. It's not a footnote. It's fundamental. It's deeply significant. It has a huge amount of public investment required to do it. So decarbonizing the world energy system over the next 30 years is a huge global priority of which we pay so far no attention. And it's getting dramatic how much time we've wasted, how much of the atmosphere we have filled with CO2, how we have nearly exhausted our so-called carbon budget to remain safe. And that's a major public effort that's required of almost unprecedented proportions, actually, and it would do a lot of good for a lot of things, but it's vital for our safety.
Yeah, actually, if someone says, if you buy into the robots are taking over everything, what will people do for work? Well, for the next several decades, we can very easily keep a lot of people usefully employed decarbonizing.
Right, this will have to be the last question, sadly. I do apologize to all of you who are waiting. So if the rest of you can sit down, but last question, quickly.
Thank you. Good evening. So I heard on the panel today that we should spend more in education. So the National Center for Education Statistics says that we spend about $630 billion, I think that was 2010, 2011, on primary and secondary school education. So it sounds like we don't spend enough, or that number sounds pretty large to me. Is it not enough dollars, or are we not spending it in the right places? Is there a lot of waste? You mentioned there's still lead paint in a lot of these schools, so how do we get over that?
Well, kids in bad neighborhoods have schools that don't have decent resources, and we have left a generation to rack up $1 trillion of debt for college-level education. And this is absolutely reckless of us on both counts, leaving kids behind, and we're leaving a lot of our kids behind because of underinvestment, and also because the way that education, all of the system is designed to let the rich fund their education and the poor suffer theirs, and that's both part of our social disaster, but it's also part of our underinvestment. And today you saw the headlines of the New York Times, the story, not exactly shocking, but the story that poor kids who are put into a better neighborhood end up doing better. Kind of duh, but and it takes economics 40 years to reach the obvious conclusion that any of us parents could have said right from the beginning. But anyway, there it is. It's true, and it's an important sign of that underinvestment in poor neighborhoods, in places where poor people live, and that's part of what this overall underinvestment is about.
Yeah, if you just saying, "Oh, look at all that money we spend," that must be too much. There's no way to evaluate that except to look at what actually happens. And maybe we spend too much in some places, but it's clear that disadvantaged Americans face radically inadequate resources for their education, that they face radically destructive financial burdens if they try to go on to higher education. And the thing is, it's so easy to fix. All it would take would be some goodwill and a little bit of compassion in our political system, which I guess means it's not going to happen for a couple of decades.
Well, you are split in terms of optimism and pessimism, but I'm sorry to disappoint all of those of you who wanted to ask a question. The fact that you were queuing up the side indicates that this is not just an issue which is very important to many of you, but it's been a great debate. I've learned a lot. It's been very challenging. It's been pretty inspiring. It's also been a lot more entertaining than two robot economics professors could have done. So I think you have a job for the moment. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.